This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, John Rada back with episode 82 of A Geek Leader podcast. And today on the show we've got Mike Cohn. Mike Cohn is the author of 3 best-selling books on Agile. He's one of the world's most sought-after and respected Scrum trainers. He's one of the ones that created the actual Scrum Master certification. So if you guys are into project management and Agile and Scrum, you will definitely know about Mike Cohn. He's the founder of Mountain Goat Software, and he specializes in training and improving the way people use the Agile process and techniques when it comes to project management. We had a really cool talk. We talked about kind of Mike's beginnings and how he got into software and technology. He got into management, project management, and some of the things that he learned using Agile and how the understanding of Scrum and Agile has helped him in his leadership and where he's at today. So it's a pretty cool conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did, and give it up for Mike Cohn.
Well, what I do these days is I help teams that are trying to become successful with Agile, particularly with Scrum, but really with just Agile in general. So I teach public courses. I do things like rent a hotel and people come, or I go into companies and help a specific company, or I do online training as well. So anything I can do to help people be successful with Agile.
That's good. So how did you get to decide to start Mountain Goat, and where did that name come from?
Well, a couple of things there. You mentioned that I started long ago as a programmer. I was actually working as an economist, and everywhere I went, they needed more programming help back in the 80s than one more economist. And so I just started doing programming at those companies, and that's what I really enjoyed doing. So it's kind of dropped out of a PhD program in economics that I was in and just kept programming, worked my way up to running a number of development organizations, and then started Mountain Goat. Just literally one day I had just a really horrible boss, and I was in there with another coworker, and we both looked at each other and said we're both too old to work with people we don't like or respect. And I quit the next day, and I think he quit about a week later, and haven't looked back, and have just kind of been doing my own thing since then with Mountain Goat.
So tell me a little bit about this boss. I love to hear stories about bad bosses. I have mine as well. But was there any one moment or one thing that just like threw you over the edge where you're just like, oh my God, I can't take this anymore?
I don't remember what the ultimate thing was, but it really began one day when she had 5 vice presidents. I was one of her 5 vice presidents. She came in and said she wanted one of us to work late each day until 7 o'clock. Not particularly doing anything, just so that employees would see us and stay late. And she would leave at like 5:15 or 5:30 or something. And I'm a workaholic anyway. It's one of the reasons I have to work for myself. Is I have this mental screw loose, which is I don't care what we're trying to write. I mean, we could be trying to rewrite Windows, and I just have the feeling that if everybody stays late tonight, we can finish it in one night. Oh, it's wrong, but it's in my head. And so I work too much, and I was already kind of working late, but I did like to go home, have dinner with my family, and then work more hours after dinner. But this boss just says, one of you have to, be here and, don't lock yourself in your office, walk around, be visible so everybody sees you. And I'm like, oh, this is ridiculous. And I couldn't handle that. And it was kind of like downhill from there. So just an absolutely horrible boss.
Yeah, I've had my fair share as well. That's don't you hate that idea of just, you just have to be there? Well, what am I supposed to be doing? Doesn't matter. Just be there.
Yeah, just be there. I kept arguing because it's like I told her that I was never after hours, and I never have been. I've always had this image that I want people working for me to leave the office at, I don't care, 4:30, whatever, but I want them to leave with their brains literally dripping in sweat because, they've just left it all there. And I don't care how many hours that takes. You're exhausted, you go home, right? And some bosses just don't get that, and I don't get along well with those.
Yeah, I made an epiphany. It was a couple of years ago when my second kid was born. I went to my boss and I said, "Hey, when I get home from work, I'm going to leave on a regular time." At the time, I was probably working 60 plus hours a week on a regular basis. And I said, "Hey, I'm going to leave, and I'm going to turn my phone off. I'm not going to answer any emails until my kids go to sleep around 8:30, and then I'll jump on and I'll work if you need me to. But from 5:30 until 8:30, I am off limits. I'm not going to do a thing." And what I found is I ended up not doing really anything in the evenings anymore after that point. But what I found is when I was at work, I knew that I had this constraint of this short period of time, and I focused so much harder. And I feel like I got twice as much work done while I was at work because I knew I had to leave. I have to leave, so I'm going to get as much done as I can.
We have a joke among a few of us in the office here that we can always tell when somebody's going on vacation because, we'll go in and do a course for a client, and we're waiting for them to tell us, what room can we ship boxes to, what time do you want to start, just logistical stuff. And you can always tell when they go on vacation, right? Because they'll answer all their email really quickly, right? You've been waiting for weeks to just tell us where to ship the boxes, and then everybody, they reply like everything all at once, and it's like, okay, somebody's trying to clean out their inbox before they go on vacation. So that type of focus does a lot. I mean, it's huge for personal productivity as well as projects.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that one. So when you were, an economist, and people at your company said, "Hey, we need a programmer," and you just jumped in and started coding. What gave you that passion or that desire to code?
I liked creating things. I think of myself somewhat still as a writer. I write books and tons of blog posts and stuff like that. So I still think of myself as a writer. And my early aspiration when I was like, teenager and stuff is I always wanted to be like a novelist, living in Greenwich Village, writing some great novel or something. And I never pursued that in any way because I don't know that I could be creative enough to ever do it. But that was like the little teenage dream. And so I liked creativity, and I don't think I have the creativity to do anything like that, but I had plenty of creativity to solve technology problems. I was, got pretty good as a programmer. So, to some extent, I always feel like I did somewhat end up living my dream because I did get hired at a company to live in New York City and be a writer. I was a writer of code, not a writer of fiction books, but it was like that was essentially 99% what my dream had been, and I liked the creative act of programming.
Mm-hmm. So how did you make that shift away from actually getting into the code to managing and then eventually getting into the Scrum and project management?
Well, I started to shift really into I'd been doing a little bit of managing kind of, since like 2 years into my career because I was presentable to clients, right? So my boss would take me to clients and things like that. And so I was always managing a little bit. And I really started to move into that around the same time, 1994, when I found I read one of the first mentions of Scrum in a book, and started then doing Scrum on that project in 1995. And I've got the nice version of the story that I can tell, which is how I came across this thing and I really thought it was going to help our projects, and it's all true, but there was all this like second ulterior motive, which was like, hey, this looks like a light enough management approach that I can still program. And, that's like my ulterior motive for why I started being agile way back then, because it was still going to leave me time as a coder. And it did for a while, right? Until our company grew quite a bit. And, by then I couldn't still code, but I dabbled a tiny bit, 5 hours a week or something, but not in any meaningful way eventually.
Yeah, that's about the way it goes when it comes to management, isn't it? You just run out of time to code, and I'm in that same boat. And I know when I first heard about Scrum, I actually heard about it from my wife, who's project manager, and she was telling me about it. And I was managing people at the time, not really projects, and our company was still using Waterfall. And she's like, you should really try Scrum. So we ended up bringing in a company to help us kind of convert to Scrum, and it was a huge shift in the way we did things and the way we thought about things. But not only that, it was what I found probably the most beneficial was the shift in the way that people communicated with one another. What are some of the advantages that you've seen when it comes to agile project management, when it comes to communication?
Well, I think you're right. It is a big communication change. There's a old saying of beware of a man in a room, which is, beware like the programmer that says, leave me alone, I'll be done in 3 months, and I've never let you down before, and just trust me. And the guy probably has let us down before, right? He just doesn't remember that the last time he said, leave me alone for 3 months, it took 4 months. And so it forces us to stay in touch with one another. I think that's a huge advantage, is making us collaborate more. I keep saying making, but I think in a good way, right? It makes us aware that we have to do those things. If we don't, we really do go dark on a project, and that's where we end up getting in trouble.
Yeah, I think one of the things I remember very specifically is before we had this shift, we'd have people that would get stuck on a problem, or they get stuck in something, and they would just kind of bury themselves in their cube, and not let anybody know that they were stuck. But then And when we were doing our stand-ups, it would be like one person would say the same thing 2 days in a row or 3 days in a row. And then they wouldn't have to ever ask for help. It was just the team would say, hey, let me help you out with that. And, because they were kind of afraid to ask for help. I know, like me, I don't like to ask for help. But they were kind of afraid to ask for help, and people would just start volunteering help, and projects would just start moving faster.
Yeah, I see that same thing happen all the time where, we're reluctant to say, I'm stuck, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. It's like, just, hey, I got a mental block here. What am I doing wrong? And being able to admit that and see others do it makes it more comfortable that we all do, and we just talk through problems. I always use the example of there's a thing called rubber duck debugging. Rubber duck, like you'd have in a kid's bathtub. Mm-hmm. And the idea there is that, you grab a rubber duck, a literal rubber duck, and the programmer explains the problem to the rubber duck, who obviously is of no help, but the act of explaining to a rubber duck, and the programmer figures it out, right? And I've never actually held up a rubber duck and talked to it. I've worked with people who have, but in particular, I remember one guy early in my career, I'd call him over all the time. His name was Chris. And I was like, Chris, I need some help. Let me just, tell you what I'm doing and see if you can figure it out. And I'm going to guess 90% of the time he never said a word. But it was immensely helpful, right? And it's that willingness to be able to say, hey, help me out, even if it's just think through a problem, not solve it for me, but help me think through this. So,
yeah,
huge.
I think that is huge. And that's one thing I've noticed as being a leader is just being there and having kind of an open door where people can come in and, vent their frustrations. Many times during the silence in between the time that they finish talking, before I say anything, they come up with their own solution.
Oh, yeah. It's being a leader is about asking the right questions, not always having the answers.
Oh, absolutely. So when you were making the shift into management, what were some of the things that you struggled with the most at first that you were able to kind of figure out and solve that you would think would be good advice to give to new leaders of software teams?
Well, I think part of it is what we just touched on, asking questions, right? I moved into manager, and I became a manager because not, to sound vain about it, but it's like I was the best programmer on the team at the time, right? So I'm asked to start leading things, right? And then that became, of course, less and less true over time. But, right, that's often the person that gets promoted is somebody who's really good at what they do. And so I felt like my job was to have the answer on things. And I had to learn later that even if I truly did have the answer, my job was more to lead somebody else to the answer so that they wouldn't need me on future problems. And that was very different for me. The other thing that was very different was I started out, I remember literally first time I became a manager thinking, well, how easy is this going to be, right? I asked people for deadlines. Programmers are always optimistic. And then I just hold them to their deadlines and get mad if they're wrong. Right? I mean, that is literally what went through my mind. And, that works once, right? And then the person realizes, whoa, he's going to hold me to this. I better pad it. Right. And, that's when I started to have to come up with better ways to figure things out and be much more collaborative about it rather than just, hey, give me your own data, I'll hold you to it.
So where did Scrum come into play with this? You said you kind of read about it and you wanted to implement it. How did that start? What was that conversation like with your boss to implement something like this?
I had a really good boss back then, so he didn't really care how I managed projects, how I did things. He was fairly hands-off in terms of I'd already had a fair amount of trust established with him from some initial successes just over the first couple months there, so he could tell I was good at what I was doing. So he never really questioned moving to that because we were always kind of doing stuff incrementally. That's always been part of my makeup. So that part wasn't hard. But I bought a book in probably 1991. The book came out in 1990 called Wicked Problems, Righteous Solutions. And I literally got it from a mail order book club. This is back when it was kind of hard to get, you couldn't go into a bookstore and buy computer books. There were a couple over in Silicon Valley called Computer Literacy, and I'd make a 3-hour drive over there every 3 months or so and buy 20 books. And this was from a online thing. It wasn't not like an Amazon. It was a mail order book club. And the book came, and it was literally the ugliest book I've ever seen. I mean, it looked like it had been mimeographed. Pages were crooked. It was just horrible. And so it's like, I'm not going to read this thing. But it was really cheap. It was like $9 book or something. So I didn't bother returning it. I just threw it on the shelf. And then in 1994, I start, managing bigger projects. I was like, I can't keep doing this with a big one-time plan because it's not working anymore. And I knew the book was about process. So I was like, okay, I had to read anything I can find on process. So I went to a library, got all the articles I could find in, like IEEE proceedings, and I read this book, Wicked Problems, Righteous Solutions, had a little description of Scrum in there, probably about 5 pages is all, and it was based on the original Harvard Business Review article from '86. And that kind of started me off as an approach. I remember talking to a couple of my programmers about how we would do this and kind of combining it with stuff we were already doing. And after that, we were just kind of off to the races and doing that project.
And was it successful the first time you tried to implement this, or was it kind of a rocky road?
No, it was very successful right off. Again, we were kind of aligned with a lot of what this was about. We were doing stuff in iterations and incrementally and things like that. So it was, it wasn't a very big change for us. We were not transitioning this company from big, heavy waterfall. This is very much a startup at the time. I think we were 100 employees when I joined, and then we were 1,600 about 2 years later. So we'd grown very quickly, but it kind of fit culturally, and we were growing so fast. Bosses were not giving me a lot of oversight because I'd been successful on initial projects. Nobody was, checking it out. Like, hey, don't do this. So.
Yeah. So, how did this, reading Wicked Problems, Righteous Solutions, and learning something about Scrum and deciding to go down that path and implement it, how did that lead into founding the Scrum Alliance?
The Scrum Alliance started as part of the Agile Alliance, and I had been doing some work with Ward Cunningham, who was one of the guys at the Agile Manifesto meeting in Snowbird in 2001. And the weekend after that meeting, he emailed me and said, "Hey, look what I did this weekend." And he, sent me a description of it and a link to the initial web page. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. This is very much aligned with what I'm already doing. And so I then was one of the co-founders of the Agile Alliance, and that was mostly with like Mary Poppendick, Jim Highsmith, a few others that were there at the very beginning. And then a lot of others came in like, a couple weeks later. But it was like Mary and I doing the paperwork and getting started. And then the Scrum Alliance started actually as a program within the Agile Alliance. And what happened there is a guy named Brian Zarnett, who I believe is now a karate instructor, or at least he stopped at the time doing Scrum to be a karate instructor in Toronto. He was the actual original founder of the Scrum Alliance. And he knew he could, only do so much as himself. So he asked Ken Schwaber and I to get involved with that, like a week later or something. So we got involved. And then what happened is we knew we were going to bring some money into the organization just by donating money through courses and things like that. But the Agile Alliance was not set up to have kind of subgroups of it have money. And, you couldn't have a bank account as like a, subgroup of another group. And so we had to spin the Scrum Alliance out of the Agile Alliance. So we did that in 2003.
That's so interesting, kind of how that all founded and started. And how did you ever think that Agile would take hold the way it has and Scrum would grow the way it has over the last, decade or so?
Oh, absolutely not. I remember it was probably December of 2005. I'd taken my daughters to a basketball game here in Denver. I don't know how many people fit in our basketball stadium, but probably like 18,000 people. And I'm standing there looking around the basketball stadium wondering, will we ever have this many people doing Scrum? And, we probably had 4,000 or 5,000 at the time. And I'm wondering, will we ever fill up an 18,000 person basketball stadium? And we were like 2 years later, we were filling up a football stadium with as many people had been through Scrum Alliance certification programs. So there's like 600,000 or more than that now. But no, I did not expect it to be as successful as it was.
Wow. What do you think you can attribute that success to?
Ken was right in an early discussion he and I had. He and I co-taught the very first Scrum Master class in May of 2003 at Bob Martin's company in Chicago, a company called Object Mentor, and we co-taught the very first class there. And up until the night before, I was begging Ken to not call it a certified course because certification to me kind of has a special meaning. You got to have decertifications, and it's more than just go to a 2-day class. And I just didn't want to call it that. And Ken was like, no, we got to call it certified. And he was right. I mean, if we hadn't called it that, I doubt Scrum would have ever gotten as popular. And who cares about Scrum, right? But if Scrum hadn't gotten as popular, Agile never would have got the traction either. So Ken was right about that, and insisting that we called it a certification program. I don't know that he knew that everybody was going to fall in love with initials after their name, and we see everybody just, all I want is a couple initials to toss in my LinkedIn profile. But he was absolutely right about making it a certified program rather than just, one more course on some topic.
Yeah, I think I've seen so many job descriptions that ask for Scrum Master certifications or things like that. And I think it's important. I think that was the right call for sure.
Yeah, it was. He was right.
So what are some things or tips that you might have for leaders that want to implement Agile that have never really done it, or maybe if they work in an environment that typically doesn't have good project management, maybe they're engineers, like infrastructure engineers, not necessarily software development. How can they implement some of the practices of Agile when it comes to managing their projects?
Well, a couple of things. They might sound somewhat contradictory, but I think they're aligned. One would be to do it by the book, and I don't care what book, but do it what I mean by that is do it in a proven, known way. So Ken Rubin has probably the best book on Scrum. It's called Essential Scrum, and it's really about Agile. I mean, Scrum is kind of like the original Agile process, so anything in there is essentially Agile, except in Scrum we got to have weird vocabulary like Scrum Master and stuff. Mm-hmm. But do it by the book. Do it in a proven way. Make sure you're successful with that, then start tweaking it, because people will start tweaking things too early, and they'll decide things like, well, let's do a 3-month iteration, right? There's nothing wrong with a 3-month iteration, and there is, but a beginner might think that that's perfectly fine. So I think do it by the book. And then the thing that may sound contradictory to that is to make sure you're staying honest to the principles of Scrum. And so if you're moving Scrum or Agile in general kind of outside of their home territory, which I consider anything to do with product development, doesn't have to be software, but it would be product development. So one of the early Scrum projects was the Sony Walkman, the original portable cassette player. And so Scrum has a big legacy in physical products as well. But if you're going to move Scrum out of its area of product development, stay true to the principles. Things like be done with something, right? I'd rather be done with one thing than halfway done with 3 things. And, talk a lot during the period, have periods where you reflect on what you've done. We call those retrospectives in Scrum. And so look at the key principles and make sure you're honoring those as part of it when you move it to another process.
Yeah, that's good. So we have a team. I just want to throw this scenario out there and kind of explain something that we tried to do with Scrum that actually worked out pretty well so far. We're still kind of in the early stages, but our help desk group, they have certain projects, but most of their time is involves answering tickets and trouble tickets and supporting things. But they do have a few projects that they do, such as rolling out new PCs, new phones, updating software. And the manager of the help desk group came to me and asked if she could go get her Scrum Master certification. She wanted to attempt to implement Scrum into the help desk team to manage their projects. And I was kind of confused on how that would work, but surprisingly, they've held true to doing it by the book. Like you said, they do their stand-ups every day. They do their sprint planning. They do their retrospectives. And I've been pleasantly surprised by how efficient the team works now.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I've seen Agile in general has gotten very popular with marketing groups. I mean, who would have thought that? I've talked to attorneys doing Scrum. They'll manage their case backlog with Scrum and have daily Scrums with their paralegals and other support staff. It's just a good way to work in terms of creating more communication and more focus. I think both of those are huge for anything that is at all collaborative.
Yeah. I want to shift gears just a little bit, because what I've noticed about reading some of your content is that you are a prolific writer. You put out a lot of content. What has the advantage that you've seen for putting out that content for your personal growth?
Well, one of the best ways to make sure that you have good thoughts on something is to write it down, right? I mean, that's kind of been established for years. So I think the act of writing something clarifies my thoughts on it. One of the things I like about writing is that I've gotten very good at figuring out ways to explain things, not because I'm particularly good at it, but if I try explaining it 10 ways, eventually I'm going to figure out a good way to do it, right? And so, I'll write something, I'll see how people respond to it, and if that works, that's how I'll teach it in a course then, or, I'll try an analogy in a course, and if that works, I'll write about it. So the more I write about it, the more ways I find to explain different topics.
Yeah, I think that is very helpful. I know that's kind of one of the reasons why I started this podcast, was just to the more I talk about these things, the more I'm exposed to it, the more I find out what sticks with people and what doesn't. What would make me a better speaker, a better teacher? I teach, part-time at the university, and having these conversations and learning from different people helps me whenever I'm preparing my material for those courses.
Yep, I would imagine.
So what did you learn the most when it comes to starting your own business? What was the biggest thing that you kind of realized was once you started Mountain Goat Software and you were dependent upon earning your own paycheck per se? You didn't have to have a company that was going to pay the bills. What was the one thing that kind of surprised you with that entrepreneurship journey?
I think it'd probably be that when you have no work, I mean, there's going to be times where you're too busy. There's going to be times when you're not busy at all. And when you have the time when it's not busy, as kind of an independent consultant or a small business, you have to somewhat celebrate that. And it's like, okay, nobody wants me this week, time to go on vacation. And I give that advice to a lot of people that ask me, they want to start their own, Agile consulting practice or something. And I'll talk to them about, hey, if, you don't have any work for a week, are you going to panic, or are you going to go, wahoo, let's fly to Hawaii, go on vacation, right? And you have to be able to understand that you are going to have periods where you're not busy and periods where you're overly busy. And, part of the benefit for me of writing so much content is I get a lot of inquiries for work, and I'm very thankful for that. But, I'll go a couple days, maybe, or a week, that'd be a long time, but I'll go a week and nobody asks me, hey, can you come into my company or something for a few days or a week? And all of a sudden I start to have those, oh no one loves me anymore. I'm done. I'll never work again. Right. And again, it's, I'm admitting I have some mental screws loose. Right. But that happens, and you just have those doubts, and you have to be the type of person that go, nobody called me this week, time for vacation. And you have to embrace that a little bit. And a lot of people really struggle with that. I've been fortunate that I don't have too big a problem with that. But it's kind of the advice I've given to a lot of people that are, asking how can I start my Agile practice and things like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that the path is always linear, but it seems to go up in mountains and valleys.
Absolutely.
So what do you think that is something that a leader would need to focus on just to be a better manager of their people? Not necessarily a project manager, not necessarily managing projects, but just people in general.
I think the big one on my mind these days, just as I've been having trouble with this with some leaders I've talked to, is be more open to experiments that may not work out. I see this so much with people where it's like, especially with Agile, and as we've gone to shorter iterations, shorter sprints in Agile, everybody gets so focused on, did we finish the 7 things we said we would do in the last 2 weeks? And, screw it. Maybe we didn't, but we came up with some other great idea instead. And I see too many people that just get too focused on kind of, I feel like it's check the boxes management, right? Did we finish the things we said we would do? And just because you said you were going to do it doesn't mean that was the right thing to do. You might have found something better. And I mean, I'm very much a planner, right? I mean, I wrote a book on planning, so I'm very much a planner, and I want to stick to plans, but you want to be open. You start doing something, and you see an opportunity. Is that a better thing to do? And I see a lot of managers that are just not as open to that as I'd like them to be. They get too obsessed with, how will I manage? How will I measure my people? And I want to measure on how many things they said they'd get done, and did they get them done? And that's just not always the right way to do it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think flexibility is important, and the openness to experiments, the way you put it, that's a great way of putting it. I can kind of see where I've had that ability. I've had bosses that have given me that flexibility to be open to experiment with different things from time to time, and how beneficial that was for my personal growth, but also the growth of my team.
I think you're right. And it goes back to one of the questions you asked me about, what did my boss, how did I convince my boss to give it a try, whatever the exact question was. And I said I didn't, right? He trusted me and let this happen. Right. What would have happened if I'd had a boss way back then that didn't trust me and wouldn't have let me try it? Right. Would I have tried it again later? I mean, I'd like to think so, but who knows? Right. So,
do you have any tips for anybody that may be new in a position to gain or earn that trust with their boss?
I think it's the same thing that we do with Agile. It's a lot of the conversations, the stuff you brought up, right? Talking to people, setting the expectation, being honest about things, right? If you're going to try something and it may not work, be open about that. Hey, I think this is a great idea, but we got to try it and see. And one of the things we do a lot in my company is we'll set up, we call them tripwires, and a tripwire would be we're going to do this if it's successful. If it achieves this goal, we're going to double down on it. And if it doesn't achieve this goal, we're going to stop. And because that probably doesn't make any sense, here's an example. We just started doing webinars within our company. And so we set goals, right? If we get this many people on a webinar, we will do more webinars. If we get below this other number, we'll kind of stop doing webinars, or we'll rethink, are they a good strategy for getting information out there? And so, when we make the decision to do a webinar, we set up a threshold. If over this, do more. If under this, stop, right? Or at least rethink them. And so each thing we do, we kind of view as an experiment. We set those tripwires in place when we set up the experiment, so we know what to do next.
So you actually define them as experiments prior to implementation. Did you put up any other boundaries other than the tripwires?
The tripwire is the action we'll take, and so it may be based on. So we do a webinar. It's obviously to get information out there. We just want to be helpful. So we try to put out webinars that have a lot of content, but you can only do so much on a webinar. So most of our webinars end with hey, if you want to learn more, here's a video course you can buy that goes into this in massive detail. Mm-hmm. And so we'll look at things like, do we get enough people on the webinar to be worth our time and the hassle and everything else that we do? But it might be based on a couple of things, number of people on the webinar, and did we get any sales or sales above a certain threshold? So we'll look at it from a couple different perspectives.
I guess you also cross-reference that with maybe the time of the day or the day of the week, or
sure,
audience you marketed to, and that kind of thing.
Sure. And that's an example. we did I'm in Colorado. My CTO, who joins me on a lot of the webinars, is in California, and that's fine. We just we do it virtually, like you and I are doing this. But we've been doing calls with Australia and time zones and things like that, and that's difficult for us. We're doing the calls at 10 o'clock at night. We've got better things to do really at 10 o'clock at night, but we want to do it as a service. But we do gauge it, right? If we get 3 people log in from Australia, it's like, okay, let's, nice effort, but let's not do it, right?
Yeah.
For 3 people, they can watch a recording, right, of one that was done in a more U.S. friendly time zone. So that's an experiment that we've done, and we got enough people that we've continued doing them. But that was a different success criteria in that case.
So what's next for Mountain Goat Software and Mike Cohn?
Well, probably more of the webinars that I'm talking about. We're trying to, we do have a lot of content out there. We're trying to get the word out on the content. We're working on things to help people. We have a lot of people take video or in-person courses, and so we've set up a community where people can stay in touch through there and get mentored about how to be better at Agile. I'm starting to work, probably over the holidays, starting to work on a new video course that I want to do. So kind of more of the same type of things, but trying to do more with computer-based learning, webinars, video courses, things like that, just because the travel gets so tough at times.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Well, one last tip that you might have for leaders before we get it out of here, just general top piece of advice that you have for a new manager.
Probably to ask more questions than you make statements. I would literally go into meetings, and on the top left of my little notepad of paper, I would just put a little slash mark, 1, 2, 3, 4 slash, right, for every time I made a statement. And then on the top right, I would put a slash, or 1, 2, 3, 4 slash for every time I asked a question. And I was trying to make sure I was asking more questions. I'm not tracking by the sentence, right? I don't know like how many sentences I just said, but I just responded with a statement. I didn't ask you a question. So I would put that as 1 slash on the top left. And I literally would go into meetings and track how many questions versus how many statements I'm making, trying to make sure that I was skewing over time to more questions.
I think that is such good advice, because I see so many managers that feel like they have to provide the answer all the time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't grow your people. That makes you the bottleneck, where your people can't solve the problem themselves.
Yeah, it's very limited. You can only go so far with that, right? And if you want to keep going, you've got to develop those people.
Well, yeah, this has been great. Do you have any place that you want people to go to connect with you or to learn more about the things that you guys are doing over at Mountain Goat Software?
Probably just our general purpose website is the best. MountainGoatSoftware.com would be the best place to find more about what I'm doing.
All right, and I'm also going to link up your Twitter and LinkedIn and blog as well.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John. I appreciate being on here.